The smell of smoke still clung to her hair. Ash dusted the hem of her tunic like a bruise. 3 days after the walls fell, Melina stood barefoot on cold flagstones while a man in bronze read a list she did not write, his voice steady as a hammer. Around her, the courtyard of the Lacedaemonian distribution house thrummed with the same mechanical efficiency that had governed the city for generations. Names, measurements, assignments, the whole of human life converted into categories on wax tablets. "You are property of the state," the official said. He did not look at her. The phrase landed inside her like a strike to the ribs, not the immediate iron of a sword, but something slower, quieter, a removal. Not death, not the end of breath, but the slow erasure of what made you you, wife, daughter, neighbor, recast into a resource for a polity with its own hunger. Melina tasted metal in the back of her throat and the sudden animal quickness of fear. Her hands, once used to weaving, to lifting a pot, to steadying a child, were empty. They hung at her sides as though she had been waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. That was the point, she realized. Someone always would. If this reaches you and you want more of these hidden histories, subscribe. She was 26, taken from a coastal deme that still smelled of olives and fish. Her husband had died in the smoke, whether on the walls or after, she could not say. The Lacedaemonians did not offer condolences. They offered a choice of categories. The procedure that decided Melina's fate was not, strictly speaking, a single law inscribed in stone. It was a set of practices and priorities, the product of a society that had been shaped by war, demographic anxiety, and the peculiar institution of the helot, a subjugated population that served as the backbone of Spartan agriculture and allowed a minority of full citizens to dedicate themselves to a life of arms. To sustain that life, the city honed its institutions, chief among them the agoge, the rigorous upbringing and training of Spartan males, and the ephors, the 5 magistrates who supervised political life. From these necessities flowed policies, and from policies flowed people, captured women, children, those marked as necessary or disposable. Some ancient writers record practices that suggest the state took a direct interest in the reproduction of captive women, while others are silent or skeptical. Modern historians debate the extent and the mechanisms. What is not debatable, at least in Melina's eyes, was the practical experience. Faces in bronze reading off lists, household assignments, a language that spoke of fertility and usefulness rather than names and memories. The wax tablet in the official's hand was small, the letters tight.
He tapped a stylus and spoke terms she had heard whispered in the days between the fall and the morning. Household service, temple dedication, cryptia assignment, for breeding, a blunt translation of a phrase that in courtly speech was softened to reproductive allocation. When the tablet came to her name, another hand added a short line: Cleomenes, house of the shield-bearer, payment in kind, children to be registered as brood of the city. Then the official signed, not with flourish, but with that same deliberate mark of administrative inevitability. Melina was led through a sequence of rooms whose paint had long since faded, past women who moved like shadows, and soldiers who kept quiet watch, as if they had been trained to do great moral violence without ever making a sound about it. There were examinations, the sort of calm, clinical assessment that makes violence bureaucratic and therefore easier to stomach. A midwife checked and nodded, an attendant measured and recorded. No one raised a voice. The rupture was performed in soft procedural tones, the way a surgeon might speak through an incision. It is necessary to pause for a brief, careful note. Sources differ on the precise legal and ritual forms that determined the fates of captured women in Sparta. Some classical authors, writing decades or centuries later, and often with their own agendas, describe practices that suggest institutionalized uses of captive women. Other evidence is fragmentary. Where the fiction of Melina's experience draws on historical claims, it does so as a dramatic reconstruction meant to illuminate the types of pressures and choices that likely faced women in similar positions, not as documentary certainty. What followed was, in many ways, modern administration. The ephors, who exercised broad authority in Sparta, were the invisible hand behind the list, men who had to weigh the city's needs against its image, its military imperatives against whispered anxieties about numbers and breeding. Spartan men need heirs.
Spartan society depended on a tight line between the full-blooded citizens and the rest. That line, for all its cruelty, resembled a cold arithmetic. Fewer citizen births meant fewer shields on the phalanx. The helot economy required stability. The agoge required young men unburdened by labor. The calculus of survival looked, in some councils, as if it could be solved through regulation of reproduction. This arithmetic produced policies and practices that tested the boundaries between public duty and private life. The agoge trained boys from childhood to suppress fear and empathy, to value the collective over the individual. Some historians argue that the cryptia, a secretive institution recorded by a few ancient sources, functioned as an internal policing mechanism, injuring helots and others deemed dangerous. Others read those accounts as partial, localized practices, rather than centralized law.
The point for Melina was not the theoretical debate, but the consequence. A city practiced the conversion of people into means. Cleomenes was a veteran, a man whose shield had been heavy with years of campaign. His face, when she first saw it up close, had the worn softness of someone who had learned to be careful with his expressions, an economy of gestures that had kept him alive. He received Melina not with cruelty, but with a kind of practiced indifference that suggested, paradoxically, a weaker version of violence. Where the state's procedures were cold and official, household coercion was intimate and bureaucratic at once. In the house, there was a rhythm and a language Melina had not been taught. At dawn, the men went to the barracks or the fields. The household women began the chores. Melina learned to fetch water in the way they liked. The stone basin must be lifted with elbows close to the ribs, and how to braid hair to keep it out of the stew pot. She learned to make the bed in the manner of Spartan women, efficient, unromantic, folded to show no tenderness or softness that could be read as affection. The household, this small ecosystem, was itself a microcosm of the city's ordering principles. Every hand had a role, every person fit into a pattern. Initially, Melina's compliance was survival instinct. The first nights were empty of comfort. Coerced intimacy came in and out of the household quietly. The men took what the law or the custom allowed, and those sitting at the margins accepted it as part of political reality. I say coerced because the distinction between consent and survival was thin and often impossible to delineate. This was not romance, not marriage as she had known it in Dakala. It was a relationship inflected by legal power and the presence of armed men outside the gate. She watched Cleomenes from the corner of the room for a long time before she judged him. There were moments when his hand brushed hers and lingered, small, almost accidental intimacies that might have been sympathy, or might have been simply the habit of holding a blade in a way that had nothing to do with tenderness. In time, she discovered that he could be moved, that he had a conscience that could be pricked. But the very qualities that made him quietly humane were also those that set him at odds with the city. A Spartan who hesitated in battle, or showed too much pity, could be suspect. Melina understood, with the clarity of the forcibly displaced, that to survive she must learn those rules as deftly as the army taught spearwork. Her strategy formed slowly, like a map she redrew by candlelight. If the city valued her for potential offspring, she could use that valuation as a shield. If household loyalty matters, she could create it. This would require compromise, calculation, and every day a small theater of acceptance.
She would perform the roles expected of her, but under that performance, preserve the parts of herself that could be offered later for bargaining. Stories of her home, names, small recipes that tasted of the past. She counted her memories like coins, spending them when necessary. Not all captivity worked this way. There were other rooms, less sheltered than Cleomenes' household. The crypteia, again, a patchy term in the sources, appeared in Melina's world as the threat that hung over those who refused or were judged unfit. For some, being sent to the crypteia meant disappearance. Ancient authors recount episodes where young Spartan men were tasked with secret patrols and sanctions against helots. Some later writers extend these practices into a broader apparatus of control, suggesting that certain captives, especially young and healthy women who resisted absorption into households, could find themselves handed over to less savory actors. Scholars debate how ubiquitous or systematic these transfers were. What cannot be denied is that in a society that institutionalized violence, pathways existed by which people could vanish. There was another, softer threat,
the temple assignments. Some women found their names entered among those given to cultic houses, sacred service that was sometimes protective and sometimes another form of sequestration. The religious veneer could obscure the political logic. A temple could be refuge or prison, depending on the needs of its patrons. Melina observed how the city's rhetoric of piety could lend moral cover to practices that were essentially administrative. The first months in Cleomenes's house stretched into seasons. Melina learned to translate the Spartan calendar of rituals and workouts into a domestic schedule. She listened at doors, mapped out which ephor carried which temper, noted when Lysandros, a Crypteia captain whose name arrived on rumor like a shadow, visited the barracks. Lysandros was the sort of man who inspired fear, not by spectacle, but by reputation, a figure whose presence signaled the possibility that the rules of propriety could be set aside when expedient. He arrived, as men like him did, with petitions framed as requests for the city's good. He argued, in clipped tones to men who listened well, for the redeployment of certain captives to assignments that better serve military or demographic priorities. To Lysandros, the world was a ledger. He might propose. Again, this is the way petitions were phrased in an institution that liked to believe in the sanctity of procedure, that certain young women be made available to the Crypteia for testing, a euphemism that had teeth. He might argue that fertile captives be moved from domestic protection and pooled to labor for the city's breeding goals. The ephors listened. They weighed their votes. Sometimes the city chose the regulated path. Sometimes it chose a harsher efficiency.
For Melina, the threat came with the slow iteration of choices that looked like options. The E-Force could offer what passed for consent, stay within the household and try to conceive with the man assigned, or be transferred for other uses. The word choice in the echoing hall of Sparta was a narrow, brittle thing. It carried the rhetorical dignity of being voluntary, while in practice it was a coerced set of constraints shaped by the presence of weapons and the calculative mind of the state. She chose to stay. What choice meant then was not a moral capitulation as much as a pragmatic decision. A child, even a child born into a city that had stripped her identity, would be a living proof that she belonged to something larger than the moment. Children in Sparta mattered not only to the parents, but to the political orders. They were a stake. A child with the right father, even if born of a captive woman, might have legal protections, a paperwork of sorts that could register as kinship the state needed. Her pregnancy was discovered in the private, anxious way pregnancies are discovered in the shadow of war. Softness noticed in a hand, tiredness that could be written off as famine. The midwife who marked her belly moved more gently now. Within the household, a subtle shift occurred. Where before she had been seen as a transient appendage, now she carried a future. The household's attentions narrowed and then widened. Cleomenes, whose tenderness had always been guarded, became more careful. He cleaned her plate more often, made sure she slept in a better corner of the room. The attention was not love in the domestic romance sense, but a pragmatic recalibration. A useful person was worth protecting. There were, of course, dangers even in that protection. Pregnancy could soften men, but it could also intensify desires. Bad actors like Lysandros took interest in such matters. The E-Force, who prided themselves on balancing abstract needs with civic piety, had their own view. For the good of the state is a phrase that often sits like a shadow in councils that make decisions about bodies and births. In Sparta, the public good was frequently measured in men-at-arms and stability. The possibility that Melina's body might be requisitioned for broader aims, moved from household stove to a state-managed brood, hung over her like a winter cloud. And yet, in that cloud, Melina learned the subtler arts of influence. She spoke to Cleomenes in ways that matched the tone of the house. She did not plead, she did not rant. She told small stories of her past that made her less alien. She learned to call to him not as a captive to a captor, but as a compatriot to a fellow human caught in the city's machinery.
She offered practical skills. She mended clothes in ways they had forgotten. She taught a child of the household how to fashion a knot that made nets more secure. And in return, she received small favors that added up. A spare cloak if winter was harsh, a tip to a helot in the field who might pass along news. The exchange was not friendship as we valorize it, but a network of dependencies engineered to survive state pressure. Melina's calculation was cold-hued and precise. Birth a child,
be a useful house member, create obligations. Each gesture became a ledger entry. When Cleomenes intervened to keep a rumor from spreading, when he wrote a note to an ephor in which he emphasized the stability Melina brought to his house, he created institutional paperwork that became a shield. In Sparta, reputation and paperwork mattered. A man who spoke for the household might protect the household, either from policy or from the random predation of men like Lysander. There were nights when Melina stood at the small window and watched the men's training across the courtyard. The boys in the agage moved with force and economy, attitudes learned by rote: endure, suppress, obey. The city turned training into temperament. Young men who emerged from the agage had learned not only to carry spear and shield, but to see the world as a set of problems to be solved in hard increments. Violence became normalized. It was not necessarily gratuitous, it was a tool. The tragedy for people like Melina was that the tool did not distinguish between counsel and cruelty. Between the cadence of household life and the larger institutions that governed it, Melina's days began to form a pattern of observation and action. She learned which officials were flexibly humane and which were doctrinaire. She discovered that the ephors, for all their power, were susceptible to narratives of domestic peace. Letters and petitions that argued for the stability a child brought could sway votes in small but meaningful ways. She used this knowledge to make a petition of her own, not to the ephors directly, but to the house and the networks around it. Small, plausible statements. Cleomenes' household is stable. The child will be trained in manners fitting a city that prizes discipline. Let her remain here. She had allies in unexpected places. Gorgo, a household woman who had been in Sparta longer and had been through other political changes, watched Melina with a steady, appraising gaze. Gorgo's life had taught her to read orders like maps. She had friends among the perioeci, and even a heelot or two she trusted for small errands. She did not offer comfort. She offered knowledge. She showed Melina how to address a letter, how to ask a favor from the smith without seeming to beg. In a society where the public language of policy often concealed a network of favors and influence, these were the skills of survival. But threats accumulated like storm clouds.
Word of Lysandros's interest percolated through the barracks. Men who had been quiet observers began to trade glances that suggested a possibility of darker outcomes. The ephors convened more often. There were meetings where men outlined their worries about numbers, of citizens, of helots, that always ended in talk of sacrifices the city might make for itself. Whatever the abstract debates among scholars about whether such conversations always led to concrete state policies, Melina lived the presence of those debates in the way doors closed a little faster at night, and in the way certain soldiers lingered too long at the edge of the courtyard. The human cost of this political arithmetic was the relentless narrowing of choices. To be taken captive was to find yourself on the wrong side of an equation, where a state's long-term needs could be weighed against your life and deemed more important. To survive meant learning how to transform your unwanted condition into a kind of leverage, how to insert yourself into a network of obligations and reputations that might count for more than the crossing of a soldier's demand. One late afternoon, not long after the child's first identifiable kicks had made Melina sit more often, a petition arrived on Cleomenes' table. It was a letter in episcopal hand, an ephor's clerk, with Lysandros' seal. The petition did not say everything openly. It never did. It suggested a reassessment of certain captives to be reallocated for the city's longer-term reproductive program, a phrase that in any other language could have been called a requisition. Cleomenes read it, and his face, usually so composed, betrayed his worry. Protection could be rescinded. A single decision from above could undo the months of cautious weaving she had performed. Melina watched him fold the letter, watched him press it under a small stone where the household kept its accounts. He did not immediately go to the ephors. The delay was not refusal, but calculation. To act rashly in Sparta was to invite suspicion. Cleomenes knew the risk of being labeled a man who sheltered too much weakness. In such a society, a reputation for softness could be fatal to both son and father. The dynamics tightened. The household became a pressure cooker of decisions made by men who believed their duty was to the city. Melina, in the intimacy of her small corner, sharpened her plans into a longer strategy. She would not be merely passive. If the world would make her a resource, then she would be a resource with an agenda. She would learn to read the city's needs and to make herself indispensable in precisely the ways the city valued most. Her plan began with the child. If she could bring a child into the world who carried a Spartan father's name and owed a debt of gratitude to a household, that child will be more than a person. It will be a living, bureaucratic argument for the mother's continued place. The first child will be the anchor.
The second would widen the net. Each child added a layer of obligation. This was a grim arithmetic, but it was one she could manipulate. Cleomenes, for his part, responded to the calculus in a way that was both surprising and dangerous. He began to hesitate in openly brutal displays. He stopped immediately when a man's hand moved toward a helot too roughly. His interventions were small but visible. Men whispered. Officers took note. Melina recognized that she was creating a political liability for him, the sort of man who could be accused of softness in an environment where softness endangered the whole. Yet she needed him. The moral compromise of their growing attachment sat on both of them like an unacknowledged debt. She bought safety with his care. He paid, in social risk, for the affection he felt, and perhaps for the conscience he could no longer entirely silence. From outside the courtyard, from the broader mechanism of Spartan governance, the pressure mounted in other ways. Reports from the helot fields hinted at revolts thwarted, at punishments administered when quotas were not met. The F-Force tightened measures in some regions, relaxed them in others, and always watched the numbers of citizen births. In councils, men spoke of the importance of keeping an unbroken line of free men who could bear arms. The language of civic continuity sounded unambiguous. Yet in private conversations, older men sometimes confessed that the city's future hinged on impossible calculations. How much privacy, how much autonomy could a state claim over its population before it erased the very civic soul it sought to preserve? Melina learned to speak that language herself. She wrote, with help from Gorgo, a small note to an F-4, careful, modest, full of the right civic terms: stability, household continuity, training for the child. It was pretense and truth braided together. When the letter did what letters sometimes do, arrived at the right desk and persuaded the right mind, Cleomenes received a quiet word of approval. Keep her where she is. The child's place must be assured. That approval bought time, not certainty. The city's hunger remained. Lysandros did not vanish from the story. He watched with the eye of a predator who knows his prey is not yet fat enough. Men like him could corrupt the institutions from within by leveraging fear and by turning procedural ambiguity into something brutal and specific. The F-Wars, for all their authority, were men who could be persuaded or frightened by the specter of scandal and scarcity. As the months progressed, Melina felt the weight of living under a governance that could turn a person into policy. Being alive was not simply to breathe. It was to be constantly negotiating value with a state that believed in broad, impersonal solutions.
She bore this negotiation with a sort of grim creativity, learning to make friends where friends could be useful, to keep enemies where they could be watched, to use the household's small forms of tenderness to build a public paper trail that would complicate bureaucratic logic. There were moments, rare and spare, in which something like tenderness came through, not romance, but the human recognition of shared plight. When the child first kicked, Cleomenes whispered the child's name in a way that was not public and not meant for others. He stood at the doorway as Melina slept, watchful in a way that was less the posture of protector and more that of someone who had found a new, dangerous care. For Melina, those moments were weapons in and of themselves. They could be deployed to build protections that passed the civic tests. They were also thawing places where two people, trapped by the same system, recognized mutual risk. But danger never sleeps. A rumor arrived, rumor that Lysandros planned to submit another petition, that he had the ear of a man in the Ephorit who leaned toward harsher solutions. Melina's heart sank, not because she had not anticipated such a movement, but because she had spent months making a precarious order that could be shredded by one stroke of office. She realized then that survival, to be durable, required more than domestic skill. It required networks beyond the household. It required friends in unlikely places who owed favors. It required the old stories she had kept in her pocket. The city had arms that reached farther than any single house. A petition could undo a mother's claims as efficiently as a sword could cut a line. Melina understood this with the bitter clarity of someone who had lost everything once and was being asked to barter the rest. So she began to extend her reach. She spoke in modest tones to a Periocean merchant who occasionally traded in Cleomenes' market, asking small questions about routes and distant ports. She left a coin here and there with a helot who knew the safe paths among the terraces.
She confided a simple truth to Gorgo: if a petition arrived, they must have options to move. Gorgo nodded and offered not sentimental consolation, but practical plans. A helot could guide a traveler to a safe house. A Periocean could carry a message disguised as market goods. Not escape, Gorgo said, but options. Always options. These beginnings of a network were fragile, but they existed. They were the opposite of the state's instruments: informal, messy, human. The city's power came from systems. Her power, such as it was, would come from relationships that could not be logged on a WAC tablet. As the late winter turned and the courtyard where boys drilled grew harder and the nights sharper, the question of what would happen next hung like frost over every morning. Melina felt the seasons more acutely now, each one a countdown toward possibilities she could not fully control.
A child was growing in her. A household's obligations were slowly knitting around her, but a single male voice in an effort chamber could still erase the fragile protections. She could choose to accept whatever the city demanded. She could choose the policy's passage into her own body, until finally she had nothing left to trade. Or she could deepen the attachments she had engineered, make the household's welfare so intertwined with her presence that the state would pay a higher price to remove her than to leave her where she was. The calculus was grim, and it was hers. The decision, when it pushed itself into place, was not sudden. Rather, it formed like ice, a clarity that arrived when the right temperature was reached. Melina sat by the small hearth, her hand resting on the place where the child moved, and looked at Cleomenes as he mended a strap for a shield. She saw in his hands the capacity for gentleness, and the cost that gentleness could entail. She saw that he had become a liability to some men she did not care to anger, and a friend to a few others whose grudging respect mattered. She understood then that she had made a strategic choice to weaponize the very thing the city valued most: kinship and childbearing. Outside the house, men argued about law, about needs, about numbers that could be made to mean almost anything. Inside the house, a woman folded linen with the concentration of someone repurposing the debris of her life into tools. She would not give herself to the city's ledger without making it pay for the privilege. The moment that closed the season's negotiations came on a day of thin, brittle light. Lysandros's petition arrived again, more formal this time, marked with the seal of a minor ever who liked to show that he could be firm. Cleomenes took the parchment into his hands and looked at Melina, not with pity, but with the unflashy decision of a man who had weighed cost and reward, and said simply, "We will make ourselves harder to remove." The phrase was not a declaration of revolt. It was a tactical instruction. It implied building obligations that could bind Epher more strongly than a petition could unbind them. It meant quietly and with grim practicality that they would increase the household's usefulness to the city in ways that would complicate the effort's arithmetic: more goods, more stability, more evidence of loyalty. It meant leaning into the thing the state respected and making it seem that removing Melina would cost the city more than it would gain. For Melina, the words landed like an affirmation and like a summons. She had not simply survived the first months. She had begun to transform the terms of her captivity into instruments of leverage. That leverage would not be enough on its own. It would need to be backed by networks, by favors and small bribes, by the unpredictable kindness of a Periocean or a helot who had once been saved from a beating.
It would need, perhaps, the subtle corruption of a man like Cleomenes into someone who would put domestic ties above civic orthodoxy. But these were strategies that could be worked, day by day. They were not the final answer. The shadow of Lysandros remained. The ephors watched. The city's appetite was not sated. The story's future could still split in many directions. The household could be exposed and stripped. The children could be taken and registered differently. The state could apply raw force. Or, with careful planning and a network working in the margins, a different outcome might be possible. Melina understood the moral cost of the path she had chosen. She had, in effect, traded some part of her autonomy to buy the lives of those she could claim as kin. She had weaponized affection, made it a tool rather than purely an end. That was a hard thing to admit, and harder to live. But in the arithmetic imposed by Sparta's institutions, it was one of the few ways a woman like her could convert vulnerability into something that might, someday, be called freedom. The winter deepened. Men moved through the courtyard with the heavy rhythm of prisoners who had also been turned into functionaries of the state. Melina bent her back over tasks with the concentration of someone who knows the world judges everyone by what they can produce.
She made her hands into instruments of survival, and in doing so began to teach another lesson, that people, even under the most relentless systems of dehumanization, will find seams and pry them open. The next step would require more than household skill. It would require difficult alliances beyond the walls, a map of favors, and the willingness to gamble on the frail improvisations of human networks. It would stretch Cleomenes in ways that might cost him his standing. It would put them both at risk from men like Lysandros, who had shown he regarded people as things to be moved and disposed of according to policy. And yet, when the child was first presented to the household, when small fingers curled around a practiced thumb, something irreversible was accomplished. That irreversible thing was not a guarantee of safety. It was instead an argument, for a time at least, a living, breathing human being who complicated the state's cold arithmetic. In a city that treated reproduction like a civic project, a child could register as both person and political fact. Melina held the baby and felt, for the first time since the walls fell, something like a claim that extended beyond her immediate body. It was not triumph. It was a small, stubborn assertion, a life that would not be written off easily. Around her, the house hummed with a cautious, guarded joy. Cleomenes watched with an intensity that was both private and political. Gorgo, who understood the city's ways, closed her eyes in what might have been relief or strategy. But the city's appetite never truly rests.